Play a little music and then we'll start. Welcome, everyone, on Agree or Disagree, the podcast that it connects you with your community. We meet every Wednesday and Tuesday talking about the things other people are afraid to talk about. My name is Kevin Olenek. You can like Agree or Disagree, the podcast on Facebook. You can add me as a friend if you want, Kevin Olenek. Follow me on Twitter at KEVOLE, SoundCloud, KEVOLE. Add me on Patreon, Spreaker.com, KEVOLE, Instagram, and subscribe to YouTube. Kinder Morgan, the two words at the pipeline of division. On one hand, you have the perspective of some, depending on who you talk to here in BC, that are very angry. They're very angry that the federal government approved the expansion of the Kinder Morgan pipeline. For them, it's about land, protection, and environment. On the other hand, you have another province, Alberta, who insists that this project get off the ground. From their perspective, they need this to go through. Their economy is in trouble, they need jobs, they need money, they need this pipeline to go through. It is a situation that has caused comments and anger and snarky remarks from both premiers, despite the fact that they're part of the same party, a wine ban, a large number of protesters, and suggestions of shutting off water, and this and that and the other. Where do we go to next? Hopefully our guest today can help us out. It is Markham Hislop for the North American EnergiNews. How are you doing?
I'm fine, Kevin. I should just point out for your listeners that we actually have a new website, and the domain is energywithani.news, ENERGI.news.
NEWS. Okay. I'm adding that to the notes right now. Let's start really by trying to simplify a very complicated situation. Where are we at right now as we are recording this?
Where we're at, it's actually not a complicated situation. The core of the dispute is over who has constitutional jurisdiction over interprovincial pipelines. So the Canadian Constitution, Section 92(10), paragraph A, gives that authority exclusively to the federal government, and then the federal government, and I should say there's probably, I think, legal precedents back to 1954 affirming that federal jurisdiction. So, but even though the federal government approves it, reviews it, approves it, and so on, there's also a provincial component to this. But the provincial component is relatively minor. It's things like tree cutting permits in the case of Burnaby, or rezoning. It's some right of way, bush clearing and things like that. And there's some environmental issues, and apparently there's some in BC. There are some Indigenous consultations as well. Now, it's important to understand that the federal government exercises its authority through the National Energy Board, which is an arm's length regulator. So that was set up in 1958. And there are processes and procedures, and the NEB is also a superior court. So when there are constitutional rulings, the NEB can actually make those rulings and then impose them on both the province and on the municipalities like the city of Burnaby. So what I've just described is probably as clear as mud, but here's what it comes down to, is the BC government, the BC NDP was always opposed to the pipeline. And they now have a minority government supported by the Green Party and Andrew Weaver, and they entered into an agreement, and one of the components of that agreement was that the government would oppose Trans Mountain expansion with every tool in the toolbox was the wording, and that's essentially what they've been doing. So here's what they do. Let's say that the Kinder Morgan needs some trees cut in order to begin work on Burnaby Mountain and around its tank farm and terminal. And it has to go to the city of Burnaby to get the permits. And the city of Burnaby drags its feet, and it really is not operating, processing it in good faith. And the Kinder Morgan gets frustrated, and it goes to the NEB. The NEB can actually issue those permits, and it has done. It did that in 2014 for some I think it was seismic work, if I'm not mistaken, and it did it again here in mid-December when it issued these tree cutting permits. And so what that's done is, and the dispute is, the constitutional dispute is, the provincial government and the municipal government cannot frustrate or impair the approval of the senior government, which is the Canadian government. And there's a principle called paramountcy that sets that out, and it's long established. But the question is, where is the line between regular permit processing and approval processing and so on, and foot dragging? And the city and the province are arguing that the Burnaby was just, sort of going through the regular motions, and the NEB was overreaching when it concluded that there was foot dragging going on. And so they're going to they've applied for leave to the Federal Court of Appeal to hear a reference case on that issue. And then the Federal Court of Appeal will rule one way or the other. And if it rules against the city and the BC government, they'll probably appeal to the Supreme Court. My constitutional experts that I interview, people like Professor James Coleman of the Dedman School of Law down in Texas, and Margot Young, who's a professor at the UBC Law, they say that it looks like the Federal Court of Appeal will probably side with the federal government. Okay, so that's one issue. There's now another issue, and this is the one that kicked off the wine ban that you were talking about. And so back in, when was it? It was January, whenever it was that Horgan announced the 5 points. And so what he said was, we're going to have consultations with British Columbians about 5 new regulations that we're going to propose. And some of them were like, if there's a spill, who gets compensated, and what role do Indigenous communities play in cleanup. They were fairly innocuous, and I think arguably fall within provincial jurisdiction. The fifth one, point number 5, the infamous point number 5, was the one that caused all the contention. And that one said that the BC government will restrict shipments of diluted bitumen into BC until a science advisory committee can be assembled, and they can study the issue of whether or not we have enough science to design an adequate spill response, whether that's the pipeline on land or whether that's the oil tanker on water and the spill is in the marine environment. Now, saying for the BC government to say that it's going to allow or disallow the shipment of oil in an interprovincial pipeline is a clear violation of federal jurisdiction. And so that's why Rachel Notley, the Alberta Premier, kind of lost her mind a little bit and announced that they were going to ban BC wine, which she did for a few weeks, and also stop talks about buying more BC electricity. The problem with that approach is that BC didn't actually do anything. It didn't pass a regulation, introduce a legislation for regulation. It did nothing but announce that it was going to talk about it. And Jim Carr, the Canadian Minister of Natural Resources, said quite rightly, he said, we don't respond to press releases. When you introduce a bill or when you actually do something that contravenes federal jurisdiction, we will jump in. And so I think it was last week or the week before, John Horgan, the BC Premier, announced that they were going to send another reference case to the Federal Court of Appeal, and they would ask the Court of Appeal to rule on that issue as well, whether or not the BC government has the authority to restrict shipments of dilbit. So those are two big cases that are going before the court now. And there's been lots of fighting over that, and lots of fighting on social media and in the media over whether or not BC is legitimately protecting the provincial environment. What's really going on there? So the court's going to sort that out, and it'll probably, I have no idea, nobody has any idea how long that's going to take. But the strategy here, in my opinion, and this is what's going on, is that both the city of Burnaby and the BC government of John Horgan are dragging their feet and dragging out the process, gumming up the works, so that Kinder Morgan, the pipeline proponent, will get frustrated and withdraw the proposal and take its lumps and go home. And so that's kind of where we stand. And in addition to all of that, Indigenous communities like the Tsleil-Waututh over in the Burrard Inlet are leading protests around Burnaby. And there was a big one a couple of, a week ago Saturday that I reported on. 7,000 people. I can tell you, it's quite something to be in a crowd of 7,000 people who are all worked up and marching over pipelines. And so that's kind of where we're at this point in the game. So I hope that I've clarified the situation for you and for your listeners.
Hope so. Yeah, we can. There's certainly a lot to unpack here. I think the first thing is let's talk maybe about. We're going to start with the BC perspective here, because right. Depending on who you talk to, there are some polls that say that BC is generally for the pipeline, and there are some people that would say that they are not for this pipeline, as evidenced by a 7,000 person protest and people still getting arrested as we go on here. What's your sense on what BC really believes, and who do we believe in terms of where BC is at for agreeing or disagreeing with the pipeline?
There was a really good poll put out on Saturday, actually, from Abacus Data, and it was a little more nuanced than some of the other polls that have gone before, because most of the polls really do show that the province is more or less split on this particular issue, and some will show a little bit more support for the anti-pipeline forces, and some will show a little bit more support for the pro-pipeline forces. But what Abacus Data did was they asked 4 questions: are you persuaded by and for sort of pro-pipeline questions, and for anti-pipeline questions. And they were questions like, are you persuaded that there's a legitimate fear of a spill from the pipeline or from an oil tank or something like that? And what it showed was that people are not just split, they're conflicted. So somebody might say, well, I really support that pipeline. I really like to see it built, but I'm really worried about a spill. Or I really think that we need to do the right thing by Alberta, but I'm really worried about something else. And people are holding they're conflicted about it. And I think for a lot of, not everybody, but there's a sizable portion sort of in the middle that is feeling that conflict. Now, it's also true, and other polling has shown that Metro Vancouver is very high opposition. I think probably 65, 70s. Some polls show 75% in places like Burnaby. So as long as you're in the, like Vancouver, Richmond, Burnaby, somewhere along the water, you're probably opposed. The further you get up the Fraser Valley, if you're in Chilliwack or Abbotsford, then you're more than likely to be supportive. And that also correlates well with political affiliation. So people who voted for Stephen Harper in the 2015 election are more likely to be pro-pipeline, and people who voted NDP are likely to be anti, and Liberals are kind of, as you would expect, somewhere in the middle with people on either side. Vancouver Island is very high opposition because of the tankers that'll be going through Juan de Fuca Strait. But then again, the north and the interior, where you get a lot of resource development, they're much more comfortable with the pipeline. And whereas the coastal First Nations are opposed, and that would include the Tsleil-Waututh. There are many other interior First Nations that have already come to agreement with Kinder Morgan and are looking forward to working on the construction of the pipeline. So it really is complex, and I think if you're a pro-pipeline person, there's lots of good news for you, and if you're an anti-pipeline person, there's also some good news for you, and it really is kind of a fluid situation.
Yeah, it depends. It certainly sees like from where I'm sitting, depends on the media perspective. You'll get some on NW that are pretty. You're hearing a pro pipeline, but you'll hear other places that are, and you talk to some NDP members specifically, and you'll hear an anti pipeline. So it is really interesting to kind of hear the inner. I like what you. It feels like it's an inner conflict right now here in BC, really, of what to do in terms of that. What about Horgan's strategy? You talked a little bit about it earlier. Now, there are some that are believing with this. The one way that you said is that you're hoping that Kinder Morgan, or Horgan is hoping that Kinder Morgan, if they drag their feet, Kinder Morgan will just throw their hands up and say, no. The other perspective is that Horgan is just trying to do as much as he kind of can, knowing he really can't do anything because, as you mentioned, there's been rulings already, and just tossing this and saying, well, this is actually Trudeau's fault. Are you a believer of that? Or what are your thoughts on the strategy that Horgan has employed so far?
My original take on this was that Horgan was doing the same thing as Derek Horgan, the mayor of Burnaby, which is delay. Back in September, I think it was, of last year, Kinder Morgan had a conference call, an investor conference call, and said that look, we're putting this project, the construction on hold for a year, so we won't start before September of 2019. Or 2018, sorry, and we're going to put all our effort into sorting out this permitting mess, and that's what we're going to do. But our investors have limited patience, and the threat there was really clear that if this doesn't get cleared up and there isn't some resolution to it, that Kinder Morgan could very well pull the pin, just like TransCanada pulled the pin on Energy East back in October and took a $1 billion hit. So pipeline companies do have a finite, amount of resources that they can put into this. Now, having said that was my opinion, but Horgan kind of threw us a curveball, because my constitutional experts have always said, you know what, neither side is likely to want to go to court on this, because once it's in front of a court, you really don't know. It's kind of a crapshoot, depending on who sits on that particular court and who's got the best lawyers. And I mean, there's, it could go either way. And who wants to roll those dice? Well, Horgan decided that he wanted to roll the dice, and that was really surprising to me, because once the Federal Court of Appeal rules, then it looks pretty bad. It looks pretty bad for the government. And then, my constitutional experts say that he's probably really lost it all at that point. He'd have to stop basically opposing the pipeline. It would be a clear demonstration of federal jurisdiction. And I wonder why they did that. Why would Horgan submit an application to the Federal Court of Appeal? He didn't have to do it. He wasn't under any pressure from the other side to do it. The other side, the federal government, certainly didn't seem to be in a rush to get it in front of the Federal Court of Appeal. Why would Horgan do that when he has arguably the most to lose out of this? So that's a question I don't have an answer for yet, but it does support the argument that you made, Kevin, that maybe Horgan, is putting up the best fight he can, but he's kind of resigned to losing it.
Yeah, and I'm hearing that from some NDP members are sensing, this is a losing battle, not the best thing, but sometimes you have to pick your battles, and this one isn't maybe the one that we're it's not one that we're going to win. It's a tough decision. That's what I'm sensing, and that's why I'm getting that sense that Horgan is doing what he can, and he's in that political. We're going to get into the other political hot button here just east of us, but he's in a little bit of a political hot button here too, because it's a minority that can certainly flip at any point in time, and he does have to play both sides a little bit carefully in a lot of ways.
I see that an argument against that he hired a hotshot lawyer, Avery, I think his name is, and a real high profile lawyer to lead the team on the 0.5 question. And so, if you were setting yourself up to lose, why would you go out and get probably the best lawyer you could to lead that application? You'd only do that arguably if you wanted to win. And so I'm not sure yet. I think we need Horgan. We need to have him show his hand a little bit more before we can really come to a conclusion about what his strategy actually is.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you went to the protest last week. There were 7,000 people there. Was it last week, or was it last week or the week before?
It was a week from Saturday.
Okay. And there was also a pro-pipeline meeting, and I'll say that politely, meaning I think there was 100 people there. There wasn't a lot of people there.
No, there was more than that. There was 300 or 400.
There was, okay. It was certainly was.
I did a count, and there was probably 300 or 400.
Okay. Certainly not as big as the protest at the mountain. What did you hear from the protesters? Was there anything that you were surprised to hear, or was it what we would normally see? And what was kind of the reaction? And what are...
I've been predicting for a long time that this was going to come down to the protesters making it difficult for Justin Trudeau, who was going to have to start throwing people in jail, both indigenous people, SFU professors, youth, lots of his, probably lots of his own voters, and what I saw at the anti-pipeline rally convinced me that that's very likely to be the case. They didn't. The protest was organized, and it was led by two men from Reuben. George would be one of them. I forget the name of the second. But these are Tsleil-Waututh folks. I don't think that they can be bought off. I don't think they can be persuaded. They struck me as being people who are very passionate, very dedicated, and I think that this is going to be probably at the end of the day, it's going to be like Standing Rock was down in North Dakota in 2016, 2017, big protest village. Lots of, Standing Rock raised $1.5 million a day, crowdfunded it. And I think you're going to see that kind of thing. You're going to see a big communications piece come out of that, and it's going to be they're going to really put the heat on Justin Trudeau. So that was my impression out of that protest. Was these are people who are committed, and the people who live in the community that are committed, they'll go to jail, they'll get arrested, they're fine with that. Civil disobedience will be rampant. Now, over at the pro-pipeline rally, it was fine. The organizer, Stuart Muir, and from ResourceWorks. ResourceWorks actually is a client of mine. I should full disclosure. They hired me to write a 6-part series on the energy transition. So I've done work for them. And Stuart's argument, his message, which is the same as Ellis Ross, who was a chief of one of the bands up from the interior. And that was, it's about the economy. It's about economic development. If we want services as Canadians, we have to sell oil, we have to sell gas, we have to sell, lumber and minerals. And so that's how we pay for the lifestyle that we have. And you can't just shut down. In fact, oil, even in the depths of the downturn here in the last few years, our oil exports were $50 billion a year, and they were bigger than automobiles. It was the biggest export that Canada has. So you can't, cut off your nose to spite your face. And I think that's a legitimate argument. And I think there are a lot of people in British Columbia who would agree with that argument. What I didn't like about that pipeline, and Kevin, you and I follow each other on social media, and you know how I feel about Vivian Krause, the conspiracy theorist around American funding of environmental NGOs, Bernard the Roughneck, the rebel media personality who shows up, with his Nomex and his hard hat and his boots and his fright wig hair, and even Robbie Picard from Fort McMurray was there, and telling silly stories about confronting Jane Fonda in the Moxie's restaurant in Fort McMurray when she was up there. That mocking environmentalists and eco-activists is, which is what they did. Those three did. Is not a winning message in Vancouver. It's not a winning message on the island. You need to, if pipeline supporters are going to hold their own or make converts, if they have to engage and they have to come with persuasive arguments that appeal to people. Like the big one, as I was saying from Abacus Data, is what's the likelihood of a spill on the water? What's the likelihood of a fast spill response in the Salish Sea? Those are the kinds of things that people will listen to. And the other thing that came out of the Abacus Data polling is that voters appear to be saying to their political leaders, we want you to dial down the drama. Don't dial it up the way Rachel Notley did, dial it down. And I think that would be the way to do it. And the approach that was taken at the anti-pipeline rally is not a positive way a positive approach.
And unfortunate, because there were some Alberta politicians that were there as well. Prasad Pranda was there, I believe, because he posted.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, sure, he spoke.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. Let's get into Rachel Notley. The wine ban, you talked a little bit about it. This is my sense, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and you will. I feel like there's a pre-Notley, a pre-Kenney Notley, and a post-Kenney Notley. There was a pre-Kenney Notley that approached BC. She was at the NDP convention a couple years ago. She approached this with a lot of intelligence, the way that you recommended, thoughtfulness, all of that. Post-Kenney, something got into her ear, and she started acting a bit more Kenney-esque with wine bans and threatening of tap shutoffs and all kinds of stuff that I don't feel like when I think of Rachel Notley, I don't think of these things. I think of a person that comes across very intelligently, very diplomatically, doesn't necessarily promote herself in the media as what she's doing, but she does things very quietly and gets things done. Do you sense the same thing? Is she under some pressure from the UCP to act a certain way to get something done?
Well, I think that's absolutely true. But I'll tell you, you're referring to a couple of columns that I've written where I called banning BC wine in Alberta and threatening to turn off the taps. I called them dumb ideas, and they were dumb ideas when Kenney had them, and they were dumb ideas when Notley talked about them in the public. And here's the reason why. I'm really convinced. You live in British Columbia. I live in British Columbia,
yeah.
And I'm I like to think I've got my finger at least a little bit on the political pulse here. And I do get to debate people, here who are opponents of the pipeline. And I'm quite convinced that if Albertans would just, whether it's industry, whether it's Notley, whether it's her ministers, whether it's whoever it is, if they would cross the Rockies, come over and spend time in Vancouver, spend time on the island, talking to opponents, and engage them in thoughtful discussion, that a lot of the misunderstanding, at least there's some progress would be made. I think British Columbians are ready to have that kind of conversation. Standing on the other side of the Rockies and throwing buns at British Columbia, all that does is make people mad. And it's certainly we've seen Horgan's political approval rise in the last couple of months as a result of that. And here's what happens at the end of the day. If I'm right, and this fall or this winter, Justin Trudeau has to instruct the RCMP to come out and start throwing protesters in jail, and it gets really, really violent, and it gets, it's a real, politically difficult for him because they're heading into an election in 2019. What both he and Notley need is for the supporters of the pipeline to be firm in their support. They don't need is for those supporters to say, well, I was a real pipeline supporter, and then Notley started, threatening to, she cut off the wine sales, and then she threatened to cut off our oil, and I'm kind of mad at it. Don't need that. That's a mistake, a political mistake. Now, on the other hand, for her domestic politics, the political gossip is that her polling has really improved in Alberta. Remember, not that long ago, Kenney was up at like 55, maybe 60%, and Notley was down in the mid-30s. And the rumor has it that, that's kind of, Notley's maybe risen 8 or 10 points, and Kenney's come down 8 or 10 points. And if that is true, now there might be a political dogfight coming into the election in May of 2019. So if Notley has made significant political gains in Alberta by bashing BC, expect more of that. Even if she's taking a risk by undermining support for the pipeline, politicians, first role of politicians is always to get reelected.
Yep.
Right? So if she's getting political benefits from bashing BC, then I would expect that we've not seen the last of the threats and the belligerent language coming out of Edmonton.
Which is really unfortunate, because this is, let's bring Kenney in. What has he... I'm trying to be objective here, but how has he ruined this conversation? Is it the blunt way to say that? I feel like he's kind of... It's like the 7-year-old kid there's two intelligent adults having an adult conversation, and the 7-year-old kid is thrown in kind of a wet towel in the middle of this and spilt some milk and has completely distracted everything. Is that an accurate way, or has he been helping this conversation?
Well, here's my problem with Jason Kenney. Now, look, I've been around long enough that I've seen a lot of opposition parties and opposition leaders in action. And their job is to oppose the government. Their job is not to make Rachel Notley's life any easier, and their job is to throw out ideas and criticisms that put her on, put the premier and the government under the spotlight. But what I've tweeted some of my criticisms about Kenney, and from a journalist's point of view, the thing that irks us the most is when people appear to deliberately get it wrong. And so I'll give you an example of the kind of thing that Kenney was tweeting about. I don't know if you remember, but a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, he was on about this, that that Justin Trudeau and the Liberals should use declaratory powers to declare that the pipeline is in the national interest, and then somehow they'll reaffirm federal jurisdiction, and the BC government and the city of Burnaby will go away with their tail between their legs. And so when I heard that, I had an interview with Professor James Coleman, and I said, Professor Coleman, what's your take? And he said, look, this is the way declaratory powers work. He said, let's say that there was a provincial road in BC, and the Canadian military decided that it needed that road. And so the federal government would say, okay, we're going to declare that road, that provincial, that's under provincial jurisdiction, we're going to declare it in the national interest, and then we're going to introduce legislation into the Parliament, and that will declare that and transfer it from provincial to federal jurisdiction. Once that legislation passes, that road is now under the federal government instead of the provincial government. So if you want to transfer something from city or provincial jurisdiction to federal jurisdiction, that's when you use declaratory powers. But you don't, when something's already under federal jurisdiction, you can't declare it to be federal because it already is. I mean, it's a silly circular argument. And Kenney went on for weeks about that, using why don't you declare it in the national interest, Prime Minister Trudeau? And of course, nobody responded because you can't do it. You can't declare something in the national interest that's already federal jurisdiction. So those are the kinds of messages that Kenney very consistently tweets about and is in the media talking about, and he's just wrong. He's got his facts wrong. He's got his interpretation of the Constitution wrong. He really, and you have to wonder, is he not paying enough attention? Is he not consulting a constitutional lawyer before he makes these comments, which is kind of troublesome? Or is he just doing this deliberately and putting out incorrect information, kind of a Trump kind of a move where it's all fake news and you throw it out there and then it gets picked up in the social media washing machine and gets spun around and next thing you know, you can't tell the difference whether it's true or not. I have a problem with that as a journalist. I really do. And so that I've been fairly critical of Kenney on that point.
Yeah. And one of the other things that he's done, and you yesterday quite rightly tried to correct everyone, and it's the whole controversy around, I pronounce her name wrong, but it says Burman. Sephora Burman, and her involvement. Now, there's been some valid criticism about her, what she's done, but at some point here, there needs to be some clarification. So for those who don't know, can we clarify her role in all of this? And
sure.
Yeah.
What happened was, I think it was 2016, Premier Notley appointed a group that called the Oil Sands Advisory Group, and it was supposed to come up with advice to the government on how to create regulations that would reduce emissions in the oil sands. And so Burman was one of the three co-chairs. The other one was an Indigenous lady whose name I can't remember, and then there was Dave Collier, who was the past CEO and president of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. He was kind of the leader of the industry group on the panel. And so at first, when she was first appointed, I defended that. I said, look, it's good to have various diverse views and environmentalist views. There's nothing wrong with having them at the table. But then what she would do is Burman would fly to Edmonton, get paid by the Alberta government and provide advice. And by all accounts, she did a fine job around the table. She's a professor. She's very bright. And so she made valuable contributions. But then she would fly back to Vancouver and bash the very oil sands that she was taking money to advise about. And I felt that was a contradiction and really kind of not cricket. And so that was my criticism. Now, OSAG has made its recommendations, and it's resulted in a bunch of greenhouse gas reduction regulations that have come out about the oil sands. But she keeps popping up all the time. She's kind of a punching bag for Kenney and the government opponents, and he was giving the government the gears for appointing her. And I pointed out, because I've talked to a couple of the members of the OSAG, and one of them, it was as background, so I can't say what was said, and I can't say who said it, but it basically said that Burman had been appointed at the request of industry because of the work she did back in the early 90s around resolving the war in the woods dispute over forestry practices. And so they felt that she would be like a bridge between the environmental opponents and industry, and that's why they asked that she be brought in. So that's again, here's and look, opposition politicians do this, but then it's also the responsibility of journalists like me to point out what the truth is. So Kenney made his argument, I countered it on Twitter, and it produced a little bit of a dust up for sure.
Yeah, because it's going to be something that he pushed it today in the legislature a little bit more. What was the role? And Notley's continuing to just, he's continuing on that track, and I'm sure it's implied in his base, but it feels a little bit disingenuous. I'm not that we can agree with what Burman has done, but I think there's a point to that it just gets too much. Now
it feels a bit sneaky.
Yeah, and there's we can get into that another time in Kenney and his sneakiness, but that's for a different show. Would you, if you're Joe Ceci, as we're recording this today, he announced that he is including presuming this whole pipeline goes through, he has included this in his forecast for his budget. Is that a wise move on his part, or or not a wise move, or do you have a lot of thoughts about that as you just learned that just before we recorded this? So,
well, I'll speak to that as an energy journalist as opposed to a legislative or financial
yeah,
journalist. So the contrary to what is commonly believed in British Columbia, especially around Metro Vancouver and on the island, there really isn't pipeline capacity, and in fact, the Canadian pipeline capacity right now is severely constrained. And one of the reasons is because last year the oil sands added 400,000 barrels a day of new production, of new supply, and they're adding another 400,000 this year of supply. And there's been no new pipelines. And then, as we know, the Keystone sprang a leak and was shut down for a while in November. And then the railways got backed up with grain and other commodities and couldn't ship rail. And so what that does is there's always, historically, there's what's called a differential. And it's the differential between the Alberta heavy crude price and the West Texas intermediate price. And it's generally about 10 to 15 bucks. And it has to do with the fact that the heavy crude is a lower quality crude, and then there's transportation issues. So that differential went from 10 bucks in the fall of last year to as high as 38 bucks. So that's $28 that is leaving both the producers, and of course the government isn't getting the tax revenue from that money. And that's a serious problem. And it needs to get resolved as quickly as possible with more takeaway capacity, whether that's railways or preferably pipelines. But it's got to be done. And so I don't know. It's a gamble on CC's part that Kinder Morgan will be able to get it through. I suspect that Trudeau and the Liberals have given Notley and CC some kind of assurance, and this is just a guess on my part, but some kind of assurance that the pipeline will go through come hell or high water, and CC on that basis has adjusted his budgeting.
fair enough. And we'll hear that more as this goes on. Let's get into Trudeau finally. Some have been rather critical of, well, both sides actually, quite frankly, have been critical of him and his lack of involvement. He was at a town hall in Nanaimo and took a lot of heat for his position on Kinder Morgan, to the point that some people walked out on him. Alberta and the pro-pipeline side is angry at him because he hasn't gotten involved in this dispute. Where are you at? What would you do if you were? What would be your recommendation to Trudeau? Has he handled this correctly? Is it wise that he stepped back? Can he do more? Is there some misconceptions? Toss 4 questions at you there.
Those are all good questions, by the way. And so, remember we were talking about the NEB Act and the NEB set up as an arm's length agency.
Yeah.
So that's how the federal government regulates interprovincial pipelines, is through an arm's length agency. So what that means is that the CEO of the NEB, whose name is Peter Watson, Justin can't pick up the phone and go, "Hey, Peter, you want to come over for a coffee over to Center Block?" and then give him instructions on how to handle Kinder Morgan. He can't do that. He can't do it under the Act. It's independent. And here's another little issue for you. So if he can't do that, and he has to let the NEB processes and procedures play out, remember all of the demands for the rule of law to be followed that came out of Alberta?
Yes.
Well, the rule of law is that if you've set up an agency and enabled it with legislation and it's arm's length, the rule of law says you have to follow the rules, and the rules are that the NEB is busy behind the scenes, and nobody. It's astonishing to me that nobody but me reads the NEB rulings, because if you look at what the NEB has done behind the scenes, it's chastised the city of Burnaby, it's issued permits, it's set up an expedited permitting dispute resolution process. It's done everything it can do at this point in the game to speed up that process and get construction going and to resolve the issues. It's held a number of route deviation meetings, because you draw out the route, and then the route has to go, oh, well, it needs to go 20 feet over this way, and we need to do, so you have to have hearings over that, and they have to be public hearings. It's held a number of those. It's busy behind the scenes doing exactly what it's supposed to do. And so one of the reasons why you don't hear Justin Trudeau talking a lot about this is there's nothing to talk about. The federal jurisdiction over that pipeline and over that project is being exercised exactly the way it's supposed to. And I challenge every time somebody will say, well, Trudeau needs to do something. And I say, well, what? What would you have him do? And I have not had one person yet come back and even suggest even something ridiculous. They just don't know. And there is, now, I do have a couple suggestions, and these would be fairly dramatic, but if an aggressive dramatic strategy is required, one of the things he could do is introduce a bill with an amendment to the NEB Act that would, under extraordinary circumstances, give the federal government the ability to provide some direction to the NEB. So under those conditions, the Prime Minister could call up the NEB CEO, have him over for coffee, and say, you need to move a little quicker on that. You need to do that. So that's one thing you could do. Now, the other thing is that it was only a month or month and a half ago that the federal Liberals, the federal government, introduced changes to how big projects like pipelines are going to be assessed. The environmental assessment will be done, and changes to the NEB itself. It'll now become the Canadian Energy Regulator. The CER will replace the NEB. So all of the assessments are going to be done by the Canadian Environmental Impact Assessment Agency or something like that. And the CER will be primarily responsible for regulation, and it won't be doing the assessments the way it has done in the past. So what Trudeau could do is he could expedite the introduction of the legislation, the enabling legislation for the CER, and in that legislation he could give the government the opportunity to intervene and give some direction to the NEB, again under exceptional circumstances. So there's at least two suggestions, and I don't know, frankly, whether that fits their political or legislative agenda, but at least that's a suggestion about what they can do. But absent that, simply calling for Justin Trudeau, for the Prime Minister, for the government to do something it's kind of silly, because they're doing exactly what they should be doing.
Yeah, and it feels like there's some sort of myth that Trudeau has to break up two adults having a conversation, and maybe it sounds like he's doing exactly what he needs to do, and there's not much that needs to really change at this point. From either side, he's doing what he can, and we'll see as this goes forward. Is there anything else we should talk about here that we haven't covered? We covered a lot in this one.
There's some things coming, some long-form journalism I'm engaged in that will be coming out over the next month that your listeners might be interested in. One of them will be a 5,000 plus word investigative report on diluted bitumen and what happens to it when it hits a marine environment. And that not so much, it wasn't so controversial this week, but it popped up last week and the week before on social media. And so what I did, rather than talk to people who have read the reports or have opinions about the reports, I actually went and I've interviewed 4 scientists now, 3 of whom are actively involved in diluted bitumen in a marine environment research, and the chief science officer for the Kalamazoo river spill, the big one, it was the biggest land pipeline spill in American history, and that was in Kalamazoo, Michigan in 2010. And so she got to study dilbit in a river environment up close and personal. And so I think that's going to be really interesting because, both pro and anti-pipeline folks are always on about the science. What does the science say? Well, I'll have talked to the scientists. And I think there'll be some surprises about what the scientists have to say.
Okay. And that's coming out.
Oh, sometime in the next month. I've got a long list of these, and as you can imagine, doing all the interviews and writing 5,000 plus words on a topic is a lot of work. So if it's not in a month, it'll be like 6 weeks or something. But I'll promise I'll get around to it.
Okay. And how do we follow you on all the social media platforms?
Well, again, going back to the website, it's energi.news, News. On Twitter, I'm at PoliticalHam. On Facebook, just Markham Hislop, Markham and Hislop, and the same on LinkedIn. So those are my 3 primary social media platforms that I use.
Awesome. Of course, you can follow me, Facebook, add me as a friend, Kevin Olenek, like, agree, or disagree the podcast on Facebook as well. Follow me, KEVOLE, or at ARD the podcast. Mostly the Twitter is KEVOLE, Instagram, KEVOLE, Patreon, Kevin Olenek 6, Spreaker.com, KEVOLE, YouTube, Kevin Olenek, SoundCloud, KEVOLE, Patreon, KEVOLE as well. Thanks for joining, Markham.
Could I put in one little plug before we go?
Absolutely.
As it turns out, I have developed a nice little sideline as a professional speaker. So I'm talking about energy topics, and I've got presentations and speeches prepared on issues like the constitutionality of around constitutional issues around Trans Mountain expansion, the energy transition, and the future of Alberta oil, stuff like that. So if any of your listeners have an organization that is looking for a speaker, I'm your man.
All right. Awesome. We will keep that in mind. And thanks a lot. And we'll talk to everyone soon. Bye for now.
Take care.